The smell of fresh coffee was just hitting my nostrils when someone started pounding on my front door at 6:30 in the morning, and I knew right then that my peaceful Saturday was about to get ruined. I shuffled to the door in my slippers and opened it to find a woman in her mid-50s standing on my porch, arms crossed, wearing a purple velour tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, and her expression suggested she'd been sucking on lemons for the past hour. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "I'm Brenda Patterson, the HOA president," she announced, as if I should be impressed. "And I'm here to inform you that you are in violation of community standards." I blinked. "Violation? I just moved in 3 weeks ago." "Exactly." She thrust a finger toward the sidewalk in front of my house. "There was a 1/4 inch of snow on your walkway yesterday morning. That's a direct violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our HOA bylaws. All walkways must be cleared of snow and ice within 2 hours of cessation of precipitation." I stared at her. It was a 1/4 inch of snow that melted by 10 in the morning. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Quinn." She pulled out a tablet from under her arm and started tapping on it. "I'm issuing you a written warning. 2 more violations and you'll face a fine of $500. $500 for not shoveling a 1/4 inch of snow. Perhaps if you can't handle the responsibilities of homeownership in Willow Creek Estates, you should consider living elsewhere." She turned on her heel and marched down my driveway, her expensive sneakers crunching on the non-existent snow. I stood there for a moment, coffee forgotten, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. I'd bought the house in this suburb of Portland, Oregon specifically because it seemed quiet and peaceful. The real estate agent had mentioned the HOA in passing, but she'd made it sound benign. Clearly, that had been a miscalculation on my part. The thing was, Brenda Patterson didn't know who I was. When I introduced myself to neighbors, I just said I was Robert Quinn, worked downtown, kept things vague. I didn't advertise that I was Judge Robert Quinn of the Multnomah County Circuit Court. I'd learned early in my career that people acted differently around judges, and I valued my privacy. I wore a suit to work, changed in my chambers, and kept my professional and personal lives carefully separated. Over the next few days, I did some research on Willow Creek Estates HOA. What I found was disturbing. Brenda Patterson had been president for 6 years, and during that time, she'd turned the association into her personal fiefdom. Fines for minor infractions, selective enforcement of rules, and a pattern of targeting homeowners she didn't like. I found online forums where residents complained about her behavior, but most were too afraid of retaliation to do anything official. The following Tuesday, I was sitting in my study after work, reviewing case files when my doorbell rang. It was Brenda again, this time with a man in tow who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Quinn," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "This is Gerald Thompson, our HOA treasurer. We're here to discuss a very serious matter." I invited them in, mostly because I was curious about what she'd come up with now. Gerald gave me an apologetic look as they sat on my couch. "Your grass," Brenda began, pulling out her tablet again. "It exceeds the maximum height of 3 inches as specified in Section 12 of our bylaws." "It's February," I said slowly. "There's barely any grass growing." Nevertheless, I measured it this morning, 3.4 inches in several locations. She showed me photos on her tablet. "That's a violation. You came onto my property to measure my grass. As HOA president, I have the right to inspect properties for compliance." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Now, I'm willing to overlook this violation if you'd be willing to do me a small favor." There it was. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of favor? Well, I live just 3 houses down, and at my age, shoveling snow is quite difficult. I've noticed you're up early most mornings. It would be neighborly of you to shovel my walkway when it snows. Just the front walkway, nothing too strenuous. In exchange, I'll be more lenient with the bylaws where you're concerned. I felt my jaw tighten. This was extortion, plain and simple. So you want me to shovel your walkway every time it snows, or you'll fine me for made-up violations? Gerald looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. I wouldn't put it so crudely, Brenda said. I'm simply suggesting a mutually beneficial arrangement between neighbors. I'll think about it, I said, standing up. Thank you for stopping by. Brenda's expression hardened. Don't think too long, Mr. Quinn. The next violation will result in a fine. After they left, I sat in my study for a long time, thinking. I'd seen cases like this before. People who got a little bit of power and let it go to their heads. The legal term was abuse of authority, and it was something I took very seriously in my courtroom. The next morning, I made some calls. I contacted several neighbors whose names I'd seen on those online forums. At first, they were hesitant to talk, but when I explained that I was gathering information about the HOA's practices, a few agreed to meet with me. On Thursday evening, I met with Tom and Susan Martinez at a coffee shop in the next town over. They were in their 30s, with 2 young kids, and they looked exhausted. Brenda has been targeting us for 2 years, Susan said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. It started when we couldn't attend one of her HOA meetings because our daughter was sick. She took it personally. We've been fined 6 times, Tom added. Once because our Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white. Another time because our car was parked in our own driveway at an angle she deemed aesthetically unpleasing. Have you fought any of these fines? We tried, Susan said. But the HOA board is stacked with her friends. Every appeal gets denied. We've paid over $3,000 in fines in the past 2 years. We're thinking about selling the house, but we can't afford to move right now. Over the next week, I spoke with 7 other families. The stories were remarkably similar. Brenda would target someone, usually over some perceived slight, and then make their lives miserable with constant violations and fines. Those who refused to pay faced liens on their properties. Those who complained too loudly found themselves facing even more scrutiny. I also discovered something interesting. 3 families had filed small claims cases against the HOA to dispute fines. All 3 cases had been scheduled in my courtroom. They were coming up in the next 2 months. But before those cases arrived, Brenda escalated things with me. It snowed again on the following Sunday, a real snow this time. About 4 inches fell overnight, and I was out at 7 in the morning, clearing my driveway and walkway. I was just finishing up when Brenda appeared, trudging through the snow in designer boots. "Mr. Quinn," she called out, "I trust you'll be coming down to clear my walkway shortly." I leaned on my shovel. "No, Mrs. Patterson, I won't be." Her face flushed red. "We had an agreement." "We had no such thing. You made a demand and I said I'd think about it. I've thought about it, and the answer is no. Then you leave me no choice." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Violation of the community snow removal timeline. Your walkway wasn't cleared until 7:15. Snow stopped falling at 5:30. That's well over 2 hours. $500 fine. The snow stopped at 5:30 in the morning. You expect people to be out shoveling in the dark. The bylaws don't make exceptions for convenience, Mr. Quinn. She smiled triumphantly. You'll receive formal notice of the fine within 24 hours. If you don't pay within 30 days, we'll place a lien on your property. I watched her march back down the street, and something snapped. I tried to be patient to handle this quietly, but Brenda Patterson was the kind of bully who only understood one thing: consequences. That afternoon, I called my colleague, Judge Patricia Hernandez. She owed me a favor, and more importantly, she had experience with HOA disputes. "Robert," she said when I explained the situation, "you need to be careful. If she figures out who you are before those cases come before you, she could claim bias." "I'm aware. But Patricia, this woman is running a protection racket. She's extorting homeowners for personal favors under threat of financial penalties. That's not just bad HOA management. That's potentially criminal." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that when those small claims cases come before me, I'm going to rule based on the law and the evidence. But I'm also thinking that maybe the district attorney's office should take a look at the HOA's financial records." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You really think there's more going on here? A tyrant who demands personal favors from homeowners, who has unchecked power over an HOA budget. I'd bet my gavel there's financial impropriety buried in those records." 2 days later, I received the formal notice of fine: $500 for delayed snow removal. The notice included a long list of the bylaws I'd supposedly violated, and a reminder that failure to pay would result in a lien. I paid the fine, not because I thought it was legitimate, but because I wanted a paper trail. Every payment, every violation notice, every piece of documentation would be useful later. The harassment didn't stop. Brenda found a new violation every few days. My trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. My car was washed in my driveway, which was apparently against Section 19 of the bylaws, because the runoff could damage community landscaping. I'd installed a small bird feeder, which required prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Each violation came with a fine or a warning. Each interaction with Brenda included another reminder that shoveling her walkway would make all of this go away. "You're being stubborn, Mr. Quinn," she told me one afternoon, standing on my porch with another violation notice. "I don't understand why you're making this so difficult. All I'm asking for is a little help from a neighbor." "What you're asking for is coerced labor under threat of financial penalties," I said calmly. "That's not being neighborly, Mrs. Patterson. That's extortion." Her eyes narrowed. "Be very careful about throwing around legal terms, Mr. Quinn. I have an excellent lawyer." "I'm sure you do." The first of the small claims cases hit my docket in late February. The plaintiffs were David and Rachel Chen, a couple in their 40s who'd been fined $2,000 over the course of a year for various violations. They were representing themselves, which was common in small claims court. Brenda showed up with her lawyer, a slick guy in an expensive suit named Marcus Webb. They clearly weren't expecting much resistance. Small claims cases involving HOAs usually went in the HOA's favor because the judges didn't have time to dive deep into the bylaws, and the homeowners rarely had legal representation. But I had time. I'd made time. The case was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I took the bench, and I saw the exact moment Brenda recognized me. Her face went from confident to pale in about 3 seconds. She whispered something urgently to her lawyer, who looked confused. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Multnomah County Circuit Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Robert Quinn presiding." I could see Brenda doing mental calculations, probably running through every interaction we'd had, every violation she'd issued me. Her lawyer was flipping through papers, clearly trying to figure out what had rattled his client. "Please be seated," I said. "We're here for Chen versus Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, you're disputing multiple fines levied by the HOA, is that correct?" David Chen stood up. Yes, Your Honor. We believe the fines were unjustified and in several cases were for violations that don't actually appear in the bylaws. Mr. Webb, you're representing the HOA. Marcus Webb stood, adjusting his tie. Yes, Your Honor. The HOA maintains that all fines were properly assessed according to the community bylaws. Very well. Mr. Chen, please present your case. What followed was a masterclass in documentation. The Chens had kept records of everything. Photos, emails, copies of the bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted. They walked through each fine, explaining why they believed it was unjustified. When it was the HOA's turn, Marcus Webb tried to argue that the HOA president had discretionary power to interpret the bylaws. That's when I started asking questions. Mr. Webb, you're arguing that Mrs. Patterson has the authority to interpret these bylaws in any way she sees fit. Within reason, Your Honor, yes. And who determines what's reasonable? The HOA board reviews all decisions. I see. I pulled out a document I'd subpoenaed. According to the HOA meeting minutes from the past 2 years, the board meets quarterly and has never overturned a single decision made by Mrs. Patterson. Is that correct? Webb hesitated. The board trusts Mrs. Patterson's judgment. Or the board is composed of Mrs. Patterson's friends who rubber stamp her decisions. I looked at Brenda. Mrs. Patterson, can you explain to the court why the Chens were fined $500 for having a wreath on their door in January? Brenda stood up stiffly. The wreath was a Christmas decoration, Your Honor. The bylaws state that holiday decorations must be removed within 1 week of the holiday. And you consider a wreath to be a Christmas decoration. It was a Christmas wreath. Mrs. Chen spoke up. It was a winter wreath with pine cones and berries. No Santa, no Christmas symbols. I looked at the photos in evidence. She was right. Mrs. Patterson, the bylaw in question specifies religious and seasonal holiday decorations. A generic winter wreath doesn't appear to fall under that category. I interpreted it as a Christmas decoration, Brenda said, her voice tight. Based on what criteria? Based on my judgment as HOA president. I see. And the $500 fine for the Chens washing their car in their driveway, can you explain that one? We went through each fine, one by one. With each explanation, it became clearer that Brenda had been making up interpretations as she went along, targeting the Chens for minor or non-existent infractions. Your Honor, Marcus Webb interjected. Surely the court recognizes that HOAs require some discretion in enforcement. We can't operate effectively if every decision is subject to litigation. Mr. Webb, there's a difference between discretion and arbitrary enforcement. What I'm seeing here is a pattern of fines that appear to have no basis in the actual bylaws. I looked at the Chens. When did these fines begin? 2 years ago, David said. Right after we complained at an HOA meeting about Mrs. Patterson using HOA funds to renovate the community center without putting it to a vote. That was interesting. You complained about financial decisions. Yes, Your Honor. The bylaws state that expenditures over $10,000 require a community vote. The renovation cost $40,000. I turned to Brenda. Mrs. Patterson, did you put the renovation to a vote? It was an emergency repair, she said quickly. The bylaws allow for emergency expenditures. What was the emergency? The community center needed updating. That's not an emergency, Mrs. Patterson. That's a preference. I sat back. Here's what I'm seeing. The Chens raised a legitimate concern about HOA finances. In response, you began targeting them with fines for increasingly trivial violations. That's not governance, that's retaliation. Marcus Webb stood up. Your Honor, I object to the characterization. Noted, but the evidence supports it. I looked at my notes. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiffs. All fines levied against David and Rachel Chen are hereby vacated. The HOA will refund the $2,000 they've paid, plus court costs. Brenda looked like she'd been slapped. Marcus Webb was whispering urgently to her, probably telling her not to say anything. Furthermore, I continued, I'm ordering a full audit of Willow Creek Estates' HOA finances for the past 5 years. Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned emergency expenditures. I want to see documentation for all of those, as well as an accounting of how HOA funds have been spent during your tenure as president. Your Honor, Webb said, standing again, is that really necessary? Yes, Mr. Webb, it is. When I see a pattern of retaliatory fines combined with questionable financial decisions, I become concerned about the overall management of the organization. The audit will be conducted by an independent forensic accountant, and the results will be made available to all HOA members. I banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. As people filed out, I saw Brenda and Marcus Webb having a heated conversation in the hallway. Brenda kept glancing back at the courtroom, her face red with anger or embarrassment or both. The Chens stopped by the bench. Thank you, Your Honor, Rachel said, her eyes wet. You have no idea what this means to us. Document everything, I told them quietly, and encourage other homeowners to do the same. I have a feeling there are more cases coming. There were. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more small claims cases appeared on my docket, all against Willow Creek Estates HOA. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood that Judge Quinn was actually Robert Quinn from Maple Street, and that he'd ruled against the HOA. Each case followed a similar pattern. Homeowner raised a concern or refused to comply with an unreasonable demand. Brenda retaliated with fines. Homeowner either paid under duress or fought back. In every case, I ruled in favor of the homeowner when the evidence showed the fines were unjustified or retaliatory. Brenda stopped showing up to the hearings after the 3rd case. Marcus Webb continued to represent the HOA, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. After I ruled against the HOA for the 4th time, he approached the bench. Your Honor, may I speak frankly? Go ahead, Mr. Webb. I've advised Mrs. Patterson to resign as HOA president and to settle the remaining cases. She's refused. I think you should know that I'm withdrawing as counsel after the current cases are resolved. Why are you telling me this? Because I think there's more going on here than just bad management. He lowered his voice. Some of the financial records she's provided don't add up. I've requested documentation 3 times, and she keeps giving me excuses. The audit will be complete in 2 weeks, I said. Make sure your withdrawal is properly documented. He nodded and walked away. The audit results came back on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my chambers, reviewing the report, when my clerk knocked on the door. Judge Quinn, you need to see this. The forensic accountant had found significant irregularities. Over the past 5 years, approximately $120,000 in HOA funds had been misappropriated. Some of it was obvious. Personal expenses charged to HOA accounts for things like spa treatments, expensive dinners, and luxury goods. Some of it was more subtle. Payments to shell companies that appeared to be owned by Brenda's relatives, inflated contractor bills where the contractors kicked back a portion to Brenda. The emergency community center renovation had actually cost $28,000, not $40,000. The difference had disappeared into various accounts. This wasn't just bad HOA management anymore. This was embezzlement and fraud. I called the district attorney's office. I explained the situation to Ada Jennifer Morrison, a sharp prosecutor I'd worked with before. How much are we talking about? She asked. Minimum 120,000, possibly more if you dig deeper. And this is the same HOA president who's been harassing you personally. Yes, though I need to be clear, that's not why I'm calling. The audit was ordered as part of legitimate court cases. What it uncovered is criminal behavior that needs to be investigated properly. Send me everything. I'll open an investigation. I forwarded the audit report and all the case files. Then I did something I rarely did. I called a meeting of all the homeowners in Willow Creek Estates. As a resident, and as someone who'd been directly affected by the HOA's actions, I felt I had both the right and the responsibility to share what I'd learned. The meeting was held at the community center on a Saturday afternoon. Nearly every household sent at least one representative. Brenda was noticeably absent. I stood at the front of the room, feeling strange to be addressing people as both their neighbor and as a judge who'd ruled on cases involving their community. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I'm Robert Quinn. Some of you know me as your neighbor on Maple Street. Some of you know me as the judge who's been hearing cases against the HOA. I called this meeting because you all have a right to know what's been happening with your homeowners association." I explained the audit findings in plain language. As I talked, I watched expressions change from confusion to anger to shock. These people had been paying HOA fees for years, trusting that the money was being used for community purposes. Instead, Brenda had been treating it like her personal bank account. "The district attorney's office has opened a criminal investigation," I continued. "I can't comment on the specifics of that investigation, but I want you to know that as HOA members, you have rights. You can vote to remove board members. You can demand accountability. You can reform your bylaws to prevent this from happening again." A man in the back stood up. "Judge Quinn, what happens to the fines we've paid? I've given the HOA $3,000 over the past 3 years. "That's a civil matter," I said. "But if the fines were unjustly levied, you have grounds to sue for reimbursement. Based on the cases I've heard, many of the fines were either improper or retaliatory." A woman near the front raised her hand. "What about Brenda? Will she go to jail?" "I can't speak to that. The DA will determine what charges, if any, are appropriate. But I can tell you that embezzlement of this magnitude is a serious crime." Tom Martinez stood up. "Judge Quinn, you've lived here for 2 months, and you've done more to help this community than anyone has in years. Why?" I thought about that. Because I saw someone abusing power, and I had the tools to do something about it. As a judge, I see people at their worst and their best. I see what happens when people think they're above the law. I couldn't let that happen in my own neighborhood. The meeting lasted 2 hours. People had questions, concerns, anger that needed venting. By the end, a group had formed to draft new HOA bylaws and to schedule an emergency election for a new board. The criminal investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the DA had enough evidence to bring charges. On a cold morning in March, I was having breakfast when I saw police cars pull up to Brenda's house 3 doors down. I watched from my window as 2 detectives knocked on her door. Brenda answered in her bathrobe, and I could see her face change when they showed her the warrant. She was arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. The bail was set at $50,000. She made bail the same day, and the first thing she did was come to my house. I opened the door to find her standing there, no longer the confident HOA tyrant but a middle-aged woman whose world was falling apart. "You did this," she said, her voice shaking. "You ruined everything. No, Mrs. Patterson, you did this to yourself." "I was just trying to make the neighborhood better. Everything I did was for the community. You stole over $100,000 from your neighbors. You extorted people for personal favors. You made people's lives miserable because you enjoyed having power over them. I never stole anything. Those were legitimate expenses. A $5,000 spa bill is not a legitimate HOA expense. Neither is your daughter's wedding catering, which you charge to the HOA account as a community event. She stared at me. How do you know about that? Because I read the audit report, because I did my job. I started to close the door. You need to leave my property, Mrs. Patterson. Wait. She put her hand on the door. Please, can't we work something out? I'll resign as president. I'll pay back some of the money. Just tell the DA you made a mistake. I can't do that, and I wouldn't even if I could. But I'll lose everything. My house, my reputation, everything. You should have thought about that before you turned the HOA into your personal piggy bank. I stepped back. Goodbye, Mrs. Patterson. And please don't come to my house again, or I'll call the police. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, listening to her cry on my porch. Part of me felt sympathy. She'd made terrible choices and now she was facing the consequences. But mostly, I felt relief. Relief that it was over, that she couldn't hurt anyone else in the neighborhood. The trial was set for July. I wouldn't be the judge, obviously. I'd have to testify as a witness to some of the HOA's actions. But I wasn't worried. The evidence was overwhelming. In the meantime, Willow Creek Estates held elections for a new HOA board. Susan Martinez was elected president. Tom Chen became treasurer. The new board immediately set about fixing the damage Brenda had done. They voted to refund all improper fines, reformed the bylaws to limit presidential power, and established financial oversight procedures. The neighborhood felt different. People who'd been afraid to speak up were suddenly chatty and friendly. Block parties were organized. The community center, which Brenda had kept locked except for approved events, was opened for regular use. I was taking out my trash one evening in April when Susan Martinez walked over. Judge Quinn, I wanted to thank you again, she said. We're having a neighborhood barbecue next weekend. We'd love for you to come. I'll be there, I said. And please, when I'm not in court, just call me Robert, she smiled. Robert it is. And hey, about those bird feeders you wanted to install, the new architectural committee approved them. Along with about 20 other applications Brenda had been sitting on for months. That made me laugh. Good to hear. As she walked away, I looked around the neighborhood. It was a nice spring evening, the kind that made you glad to be alive and living in the Pacific Northwest. Kids were playing in yards, people were walking dogs, everything looked peaceful. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Ada Morrison. Patterson took a plea deal. 5 years restitution of full amount, avoids trial. I texted back. Good outcome. Couldn't have done it without your audit order. Thanks for the assist. I put my phone away and went back inside. The case was closed. Brenda Patterson would serve her time, pay back the money she'd stolen, and hopefully learn something about the consequences of abusing power. The following week, I was shoveling my walkway after a late spring snow when I noticed someone had already cleared the sidewalk in front of my house. I looked around and saw Tom Martinez down the street with a snowblower. He waved. Figured I'd get the whole block. Easier with the machine anyway. I waved back. That was the difference between Brenda's version of community and the real thing. Real neighbors helped each other because they wanted to, not because they were coerced or threatened. The neighborhood barbecue was exactly what Willow Creek Estates needed. Nearly every household attended. There was food, music, and a lot of conversation about the new direction of the HOA. Several people approached me to thank me for standing up to Brenda, but I deflected the credit. You all did the hard part, I told them. You kept records, you filed cases, you didn't give up even when it seemed hopeless. I just did my job. David Chen clinked his beer bottle against mine. Your job involved facing down the person who was actively harassing you. That takes guts. It takes a belief in the system, I said. I've spent 20 years as a judge watching people abuse power in big and small ways. The law exists to protect people from exactly that kind of abuse. If I couldn't apply it in my own life, what kind of hypocrite would I be? As the sun set and the barbecue wound down, I found myself sitting on a picnic bench with a group of neighbors, listening to them make plans for the community. A neighborhood watch program, a community garden, a fund to help families who were struggling to pay their mortgages because of the fines they'd incurred under Brenda's reign. This was what an HOA was supposed to be. Not a tool for one person's ego and enrichment, but a way for neighbors to work together to make their community better. Later that night, back in my house, I poured myself a bourbon and sat in my study. I thought about the past few months, from that first morning when Brenda had pounded on my door to the plea deal that had just closed the criminal case. It had started with something so petty, her demand that I shovel her walkway. But that petness had been a symptom of something much larger, a fundamental corruption of the system that was supposed to serve the community. I'd seen it before in court. People who started with small abuses of power and graduated to larger ones. Give someone unchecked authority and some percentage of them will inevitably abuse it. That's why we have courts, laws, oversight mechanisms. Not because everyone is corrupt, but because power needs to be balanced and accountable. My phone rang. It was Patricia Hernandez. I heard about the plea deal, she said. Congratulations. Thanks for your help early on. I didn't do much. You did the heavy lifting. She paused. You know, you could have recused yourself from those HOA cases. Technically, you had a conflict of interest. I thought about it, I admitted. But the conflict would have been if I'd let personal feelings influence my rulings. I didn't. I ruled based on the evidence and the law. The fact that Brenda was also harassing me just meant I understood exactly what these homeowners were going through. Still, some judges would have stepped back and let someone else handle it. These were small claims cases, Patricia. They get 15 minutes of court time if they're lucky. Another judge might have just rubber-stamped the HOA's position and moved on. These homeowners needed someone to actually look at the evidence. You're probably right, she laughed. I just hope you're enjoying your new neighborhood now that the dragon has been slain. I am. It's actually turning into a nice place to live. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and checked my email. There was a message from the new HOA board with the minutes from their latest meeting. Reading through them, I was struck by how different they were from Brenda's reign. Actual discussions of community issues, votes on expenditures, transparency about finances. One item caught my eye. The board had voted to rename the community center the Martinez Community Center in honor of Susan and Tom's work to reform the HOA. It was a nice gesture, and I made a note to support it. Over the next few months, I watched Willow Creek Estates transform. The fear that had permeated the neighborhood evaporated. People invested in their homes again, planting gardens and making improvements without worrying about arbitrary fines. New families moved in, attracted by the strong community feel. Brenda's house sat empty for a while. She'd moved in with her daughter in Seattle while awaiting sentencing. Eventually, it sold to a young couple with a baby. I met them when they moved in, helped them carry some boxes. We heard this used to be the HOA president's house, the husband said, wiping sweat from his forehead. People warned us about her. That's all in the past, I said. The neighborhood is under new management now. The sentencing hearing was in July, and I attended as a witness and as a community member who'd been affected by Brenda's actions. The courtroom was packed with residents of Willow Creek Estates, all wanting to see justice served. Judge Martin Schaffer presided. He was a colleague of mine, a good judge who took white-collar crime seriously. Brenda sat at the defense table in a conservative suit, looking diminished and older than her years. The prosecutor laid out the case. $127,000 embezzled over 5 years. Detailed evidence of personal expenses charged to HOA accounts. Shell companies set up to funnel money. Systematic abuse of authority. Brenda's lawyer argued for leniency. She'd repaid $50,000 already, would pay the rest over time. She had no prior criminal record. She'd served the community for years before these unfortunate decisions. When it was time for victim impact statements, several homeowners spoke. The Chens talked about the financial stress of fighting unjust fines. Another couple described being forced to take out a loan to pay HOA penalties. A single mother explained how she'd almost lost her house to an HOA lien. Then Judge Schaffer asked if anyone else wanted to speak. I stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court." Brenda's head whipped around. She hadn't expected this. "State your name for the record," Judge Schaffer said. "Robert Quinn, Your Honor. I'm a resident of Willow Creek Estates and a judge in this county." Schaffer nodded. He knew who I was. "I want to speak to the pattern of behavior we've seen from Miss Patterson," I began. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was a systematic abuse of power that poisoned an entire community. Miss Patterson used her position to extort personal favors from homeowners under threat of financial penalties. She targeted anyone who questioned her authority. She created an atmosphere of fear that prevented people from speaking up. I looked at Brenda. She was staring at her hands. I saw this behavior firsthand when she demanded I shovel her walkway every morning, threatening me with fines if I refused. That might seem trivial compared to the embezzlement, but it shows her mindset. She believed she was entitled to whatever she wanted from the people she was supposed to serve. "Your point, Judge Quinn?" Schaffer asked. "My point is that the financial crimes are serious, but the damage to the community goes beyond money. People don't trust their neighbors anymore because Miss Patterson encouraged them to spy on each other. People are afraid to serve on the HOA board because they saw what happens when power is abused. The restitution will repay the money, but it won't repair the social fabric she tore apart." I sat down. Brenda was crying now, quiet tears running down her face. Judge Schaffer took a moment before speaking. "Miss Patterson, please stand." She stood, wobbling slightly. Her lawyer steadied her. "I've reviewed the evidence and considered the arguments," Schaffer said. "The financial crimes alone would warrant significant prison time. But Judge Quinn is right. There's a broader pattern of abuse here that demonstrates a fundamental disregard for the people you were supposed to serve." He looked at the file in front of him. "You're sentenced to 5 years in state prison in accordance with your plea agreement. You will pay restitution of $127,000 plus interest. Additionally, you are permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership position." The gavel came down. Brenda collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Her lawyer was talking to her, but she wasn't listening. Bailiffs came forward to take her into custody. As they led her out, she looked at me. There was no anger in her expression anymore, just defeat and regret. I felt a moment of sadness for her. She'd had a chance to serve her community, to make a real difference. Instead, she'd chosen grade and ego. Now she'd spend years in prison, and even after she got out, she'd carry the stigma of her crimes forever. Outside the courthouse, Susan Martinez caught up with me. "Thank you for speaking," she said. "You articulated what a lot of us were feeling." "I hope it helps the healing process," I said. "It will," she smiled. You know, the community has been talking. We'd like you to consider joining the HOA board. We need people who understand governance and accountability." I laughed. After all this, you think anyone wants a judge on their HOA board, especially after all this? We want someone who'll keep us honest, who'll make sure we never end up with another Brenda situation. I thought about it. Let me consider it, but I'll tell you what, I'm happy to review your bylaws and procedures anytime. Make sure they're solid and fair. We'll take you up on that. As I drove home, I felt a sense of closure. The system had worked the way it was supposed to. Evidence was gathered, a trial held, justice served. It wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was fair and it was transparent. That evening, I sat on my back porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. Kids were playing basketball in a driveway down the street. A couple was walking their dog. Someone was grilling, the smell of barbecue drifting through the air. This was what I'd wanted when I bought the house. Peace, community. A place to come home to after long days in court dealing with the worst of human behavior. Brenda had almost ruined that. But in trying to control everything, she'd ultimately lost everything. And the community she'd terrorized had emerged stronger and more united. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Chen. "Neighborhood movie night this Friday. Kids movie at 7, adult movie at 9. Bring a chair and snacks. Your choice of movies won." I smiled. They'd taken a vote on what to show, and apparently my suggestion of a classic courtroom drama had won for the adult showing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I texted back confirmation and leaned back in my chair. The sky was turning purple and orange, stars beginning to emerge. Somewhere in the house, my phone was ringing, probably work-related. But for this moment, I was just Robert Quinn, homeowner, neighbor, guy who liked watching sunsets on his porch. The legal system had done its job. Brenda Patterson would serve her time and pay her debt to society. The HOA had been reformed with better oversight and leadership. The neighborhood was healing, and me. I'd learned that you can't separate your professional life from your personal life as cleanly as you'd like. I was a judge, yes, but I was also a citizen and a community member. When I saw injustice, even petty HOA injustice, I had a responsibility to act. Would I have handled it differently if I'd known from the start how deep Brenda's crimes went? Probably not. Sometimes you start pulling on a thread and the whole sweater unravels. That's what investigations are, following evidence wherever it leads. The next few weeks passed quietly. I settled into a routine, work during the week, neighborhood activities on weekends. The movie night was a success, with about 30 people showing up. We watched the kids' movie first, then after the children went home, the adults stayed for the courtroom drama. People kept looking at me during the trial scenes, grinning. "Is it really like that?" someone asked during a break. "Sometimes," I said. Though real trials are usually less dramatic and involve a lot more paperwork. In August, the HOA held its first annual meeting under the new leadership. I attended, curious to see how different it would be from Brenda's reign. Instead of a tense, fearful gathering, it was actually productive. The board presented financial reports, explained decisions, answered questions. When disagreements arose, they were handled with discussion and compromise, not threats and fines. Near the end of the meeting, Susan stood up to make an announcement. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who made all of this possible," she said. When Brenda Patterson was running this HOA like her personal kingdom, most of us were too afraid to stand up to her. But one person did. He stood up not just for himself, but for all of us. "Robert Quinn, would you please stand?" Reluctantly, I stood. People started applauding. "Robert showed us that power needs to be accountable," Susan continued. "That communities work best when everyone has a voice." Because of him, we have an HOA that actually serves our interests instead of one person's ego. Thank you, Robert. The applause continued. I felt embarrassed but also proud. Not proud of myself necessarily, but proud of what the community had become. Thank you, I said when the applause died down. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this alone. Every person who filed a case, who documented violations, who refused to be intimidated, you were the ones who made this possible. I just happened to be in a position to help. This is your community, your victory. More applause, and then the meeting moved on to other business. After it ended, I was walking to my car when I ran into Gerald Thompson, the former HOA treasurer who'd accompanied Brenda on that first visit to my house. He looked sheepish. "Judge Quinn, I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For not standing up to Brenda sooner. I knew something wasn't right with the finances. I questioned her a few times, but she always had explanations and I didn't push. I was a coward." "You weren't a coward," I said. "You were in a difficult position." She had power and she wasn't afraid to use it against anyone who challenged her. Still, I should have done more. When I saw what was in that audit report, I felt sick. I'd been signing off on those financial statements for years. The DA didn't charge you with anything. That tells me they didn't find evidence of willful wrongdoing on your part. I know, but I still feel responsible. He looked at the community center. I'm not running for the board again. I think the HOA needs fresh leadership, people who weren't part of the old regime. That's probably smart, I said. But don't beat yourself up too much, Gerald. You cooperated with the investigation, you helped piece together the financial records. That mattered. He nodded, looking slightly less miserable. Thanks, Judge. And thanks for having the guts to do what needed to be done. As I drove home, I thought about accountability and complicity. Gerald hadn't stolen money or intentionally harmed anyone, but his passivity had enabled Brenda's behavior. It was a reminder that good people sometimes allow bad things to happen, not out of malice but out of fear or inertia. That's why systems of oversight matter. Why checks and balances exist. Why we can't rely on individuals to always do the right thing without accountability. Fall came to Willow Creek Estates, bringing brilliant colors to the trees and a crispness to the air. I fell into a comfortable rhythm of life. Work, home, neighborhood events. It was everything I'd hoped for when I bought the house. One Saturday in October, I was raking leaves when a moving truck pulled up across the street. A family was moving in, parents and 2 teenagers. I walked over to introduce myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking hands with the father. "I'm Robert Quinn." "James Porter," he said. "This is my wife Linda and our kids, Sarah and Michael. Great to meet you. If you need anything, I'm right across the street." "Thanks," Linda said. "We heard this is a really nice neighborhood, strong community feel." "It is now," I said. "Took some work to get there, but it's worth it." Over the next few hours, several neighbors showed up to help the Porters move in. It was the kind of spontaneous neighborliness that Brenda's HOA had nearly destroyed. People brought food, helped carry boxes, welcomed the new family. As I carried a lamp into the house, James pulled me aside. "Is it true what they're saying? That the old HOA president went to prison?" "It's true," I said, "but that's ancient history now. The new board is excellent, very focused on actually serving the community." "That's good to hear." We were a little nervous when we saw HOA in the listing, but everyone we've talked to says it's different now. It is. Night and day difference. That conversation repeated itself with other new families who moved into the neighborhood over the following months. Willow Creek Estates was developing a reputation, not as the place with the tyrannical HOA president, but as a community that had reformed itself, that had chosen accountability and transparency over power and corruption. The holidays came, and for the first time in years, according to longtime residents, the neighborhood actually felt festive. People decorated without fear of arbitrary fines. The HOA organized a light contest that was about fun, not about enforcement. Kids went caroling. We had a neighborhood potluck on Christmas Eve. I stood in my living room on Christmas night, looking out at the decorated houses, the lights twinkling in windows up and down the street. A year ago, I'd been moving into a new house, unaware of the drama that was about to unfold. Now I was part of a community that felt genuine and supportive. My phone rang. It was Patricia Hernandez. "Merry Christmas, Robert. Merry Christmas, Patricia. I was thinking about you today, thinking about that HOA situation. You know, it could have gone very differently." "How do you mean?" "You could have just moved when the harassment started, sold the house, found somewhere else. It would have been easier." "Easier for me maybe, but it wouldn't have helped anyone else." "Exactly. You stayed and fought, and now dozens of families have a better place to live because of it." She paused. "I'm proud of you, Robert. What you did wasn't easy, and it wasn't just about being a judge. It was about being a good person." After we hung up, I thought about her words. She was right that it hadn't been easy. There were moments when I'd questioned whether it was worth the hassle, whether I should just pay the fines and keep my head down. But I couldn't. Not because I'm particularly brave or noble, but because I've spent my career believing in systems of justice and accountability. If I couldn't stand up for those principles in my own life, how could I uphold them in court? The new year came, bringing with it a sense of renewal. At the HOA's January meeting, the board announced that they'd completed repaying all the improper fines from Brenda's tenure. Families who'd been financially squeezed for years were finally made whole. Tom Chen stood up during the meeting. "I want to propose something. We have money left in our reserve fund after making all the refunds. I think we should use some of it to create a scholarship for local high school students, a way of turning something negative into something positive for the next generation." The proposal passed unanimously. The scholarship would be called the Willow Creek Estates Good Governance Scholarship, awarded to students interested in public service, law, or community organizing. When Susan asked me to serve on the scholarship committee, I agreed immediately. It felt like the right way to close this chapter, to transform a story about corruption and abuse into one about recovery and hope. We awarded the first scholarship in May. The recipient was a young woman named Sofia Ramirez, who wanted to study political science and work in local government reform. At the award ceremony, she gave a short speech. "Growing up, I always heard my parents complain about HOAs and local government, about how regular people had no power," she said. "But then I saw what happened in Willow Creek Estates. I saw a community stand up to corruption. I saw people use the legal system to fight back, and I realized that change is possible if you're willing to work for it." I caught Susan's eye across the room. She was crying, happy tears this time. That summer, I was working in my garden when a car pulled up. A woman got out, someone I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was Brenda Patterson. She looked different, thinner, grayer, older. Prison had not been kind to her. "Mr. Quinn," she said, staying on the sidewalk, "I'm not supposed to be here. It's probably a violation of my parole. But I needed to talk to you." I stood up, brushing dirt off my knees. "What do you want, Mrs. Patterson?" I wanted to apologize. "For everything. For harassing you, for what I did to the neighborhood. I've had a lot of time to think about my choices, and I'm ashamed." I studied her face. She seemed sincere, but I'd learned to be cautious. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully. "But I'm not the only person you owe one to, I know. I've been writing letters. To the Chens, to the Martinses, to everyone I hurt. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to try to make amends." That's between you and them. She nodded. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What you did, holding me accountable, it was the right thing. At the time, I hated you for it. But now I see that you probably saved me from doing even worse things. You saved yourself when you took the plea deal and started paying restitution, I said. That was your choice. Maybe. She looked at the neighborhood, at the well-maintained houses and the kids playing in the street. It looks good, better than when I was in charge. It is better. Because people aren't afraid anymore. I'm glad. She turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, I'm moving to California. My daughter lives there. Fresh start, you know, so you won't have to worry about me coming back. Good luck, Mrs. Patterson. I watched her drive away, and I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that she was gone. Satisfaction that she'd acknowledged her wrongs. And a little bit of pity for someone who'd thrown away so much for so little. That evening, I mentioned the visit to Susan Martinez at a neighborhood gathering. She came back, Susan said, surprised. That took guts, or desperation, I'm not sure which. Does it matter? She apologized. That's more than I expected from her. True enough. Susan looked around at the gathering, at the neighbors laughing and talking, at the kids running around playing tag. You know, Robert, sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't moved here, if Brenda had just continued for another 5 or 10 years. Someone else would have stopped her eventually. Maybe, but maybe not. A lot of us were too beaten down to fight anymore. You gave us hope that standing up was possible. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just clinked my beer bottle against hers and changed the subject. As summer turned to fall again, I reflected on everything that had happened since I'd moved to Willow Creek Estates. What had started as a simple desire for a quiet place to live had turned into a battle against corruption, and then into the rebuilding of a community. I'd learned things about myself in the process, that I couldn't separate who I was as a judge from who I was as a person. That standing up for principles sometimes meant making your life harder in the short term. That communities were fragile things that required constant tending and protection. But I'd also learned that people were fundamentally good. When given the chance, most people would choose fairness over corruption, community over ego, service over self-interest. Brenda Patterson was an aberration, not the norm. One evening in late September, I was sitting on my porch when Tom Martinez walked by walking his dog. Hey, Robert, got a minute? Sure, what's up? He sat down on the porch steps. I was talking to some folks and we were thinking, this whole thing with Brenda, it's a pretty remarkable story. Have you ever thought about writing it down? Maybe sharing it so other communities can learn from it? I've thought about it, I admitted, but I'm not sure how much interest there would be in HOA drama. Tom laughed. You'd be surprised. There are millions of people living under HOAs, and a lot of them are dealing with similar problems. What you did here, how you used the legal system to hold a corrupt leader accountable, that's a roadmap others could follow. Maybe you're right. Think about it. You've got a unique perspective as both a resident and a judge, and the story has a good ending that matters. After he left, I sat there thinking, maybe he was right. Maybe there was value in documenting what had happened, not to glorify my role, but to show that change was possible, that standing up to abuse was worth it. I went inside and opened my laptop. I started typing, beginning with that first morning when Brenda had pounded on my door demanding I shovel her walkway. As I wrote, I realized how much had happened in such a short time. How one person's corruption had poisoned an entire community, and how that community had fought back and won. It took me several weeks to write it all down. I shared drafts with several neighbors, asking for their perspectives and corrections. The Chens added details I'd missed. Susan provided insight into the HOA's operations before my arrival. Even Gerald Thompson contributed, explaining how Brenda had manipulated the board. When it was finished, I had a comprehensive account of everything that had happened. I sent it to a few legal journals, thinking it might have value as a case study in HOA governance and abuse of authority. To my surprise, it generated significant interest. One journal published it, and suddenly I was getting emails from HOA reform activists, from lawyers representing clients in similar situations, from residents dealing with their own corrupt HOA boards. "Your story gives us hope," one person wrote. "We've been fighting our HOA for 3 years, and we were about to give up. Now we know it's possible to win." Another email came from a law professor who wanted to use the case in her property law class as an example of HOA oversight and accountability. The attention was a bit overwhelming, but it was also gratifying. If our experience could help others, then all the stress and conflict had been worth it. As winter approached again, marking nearly 2 years since I'd moved to Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood prepared for the holidays. This year, there was talk of making the decorating contest an annual tradition, of having a New Year's Eve block party, of all the ways a healthy community celebrates together. I was stringing lights on my porch when Susan walked over with a plate of cookies. "Thought you might need some fuel," she said, handing me the plate. "Thanks." I bit into a cookie. "These are amazing. Old family recipe." She looked up at the lights I was hanging. "You know, 2 years ago, I never would have imagined things could be this good." I was seriously considering moving. A lot of people were. But you didn't. Even when Brenda was making your life miserable, you stayed and fought. Why? I thought about that question. I'd been asked it before in various forms, but I'd never quite articulated the answer to my own satisfaction. "Because running away doesn't fix the problem," I finally said. "It just leaves it for someone else to deal with. And because I believe in systems and laws and accountability. If those things don't work, nothing works. So when I saw them being abused, I had to act. Not because I'm particularly brave, but because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." Susan smiled. "Well, whatever the reason, we're grateful you did." After she left, I finished hanging the lights and stood back to admire my work. The porch looked festive, welcoming. Down the street, other houses were decorated too, each one reflecting the personality of the family inside. This was home now. Not just a house, but a real home in a real community. A place where people looked out for each other, where the HOA actually served its purpose, where kids could play in the streets and families could build lives without fear of arbitrary punishment. Brenda Patterson had tried to build a kingdom for herself, but she'd forgotten the most important rule of leadership. You serve the people, not the other way around. When she forgot that, the system corrected itself. It wasn't quick and it wasn't easy, but it worked. That night, I sat in my study with a glass of bourbon, looking at the photos from the past year. The community barbecue, the scholarship award ceremony, the neighborhood movie night, Halloween trick or treating, all the moments that make up a real community. My phone buzzed with a text from the neighborhood group chat. Someone had posted a photo of all the decorated houses on the street, a panorama of lights and colors. "Best neighborhood in Portland," the message read, followed by a string of heart emojis. I smiled and added my own message. "Agreed. Lucky to live here." And I meant it. Despite everything that had happened, or maybe because of it, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The fight against Brenda's corruption had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had also brought the neighborhood together in a way that never would have happened otherwise. Sometimes good things come from standing up to bad situations. Sometimes the legal system works exactly the way it's supposed to. And sometimes, when you're willing to fight for what's right, you end up with something better than you imagined. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the neighborhood, to the neighbors who'd fought alongside me, to the system that had held a corrupt leader accountable. Then I turned off the light and headed to bed, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another peaceful day in Willow Creek Estates, a community that had learned the hard way that good governance matters and that accountability is worth fighting for.